Welcome to the Non-Breaking Space Show from Austin, Texas. I'm the Internet's Christopher Schmidt. On today's show, we are joined with Keith Grant, author of CSS In-Depth, a new book for helping people write better CSS. Before we get started, some things I'd like you to know. The UX Design Newsletter is a weekly list of articles, tutorials, and inspiration, handpicked by me. Sign up at uxdesignnewsletter.com and have the best links of the week sent to your email. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Teleject, Teleject. And now, on with the show. How did you get involved with the web? Actually, how did you get started? What was your first contact with the web? And
my first contact with the web was I was in high school in the 90s, and we had AOL. And at some point, AOL let you throw up a website. They'd provide hosting, and so it was just a process of view source, see how things worked, fiddle with. Originally, it was the font tags and the center tags and inlining all the background colors, and I just had fun fiddling with colors and backgrounds and writing content that was just nonsense. I mean, it was I was playing video games, so I'll put information about Quake or whatever on a website. But I just mostly had fun building the website. So I've been doing this since early on. So
in Quake, for those people who don't know, it's sort of like Overwatch for today's age. Is that right? I guess that's how.
I haven't actually played Overwatch, so I couldn't say.
Yeah, neither have I, because I think we're in the same kind of boat, because I was just like, I know of Overwatch, but I feel like when I looked into it, it was like, hey, that's like Quake. But a lot more fun and mainstream than it was when I played it. So yeah, cool. So that's how I got hooked back then. And you've actually spoken at CSS DevConf, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
a couple years ago.
Yeah, I was like, I knew you. I was like, yeah. So yeah, I don't remember much about doing the conferences, because like I love putting on the conferences, but it's such a big blur. Like,
I can imagine.
Yeah. So
you're just worried about all the details.
Yeah. So I'm glad we have this opportunity to talk. So it's been very good. And so your talk, I just want to talk about just briefly, was about stop thinking pixels. Mm-hmm. Right. So I don't think I actually saw your presentation because I'm running around. So what was the gist of your talk back then?
The gist of my talk was primarily just about focusing on the benefits of EMS and relative sizing on the web, and how pixel perfect design and trying to measure every little thing is kind of doing you a disservice, because if you just can free yourself from worrying about exact measurements, those measurements don't really matter. And you can use relative units like EMS, and sizing things in EMS makes sense if you aren't obsessed with how does it exactly calculate out, how does it measure out. And I talked about doing font sizing, scaling, modular scalar sizes for fonts, and things like that.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing I've noticed is that people like embrace media queries, and they sort of approach it as, oh, great, I'm setting this grid, my canvas, if you will, to be, like 900 pixels wide. And then in that canvas, I can say between this, fudge area of like 900 pixels to like whatever the next breakpoint would be, I can just gleefully set my font sizes to 12px pixels and stuff like that. And then so they set their font sizes to pixels, for all these various shapes. And I don't know, just I find that like a bad practice. Like would you recommend that, or would you still recommend like EMs or?
Yeah, I definitely prefer EMs and REMs. I mean, if you use EMs can get hairy for font size just because of the way you're defining font size in terms of font size. But REMs is a perfect workaround for that. And the great thing is, if you do your breakpoints, you can change what a REM means. And so at a larger breakpoint, on the HTML element, if your font size is say 18 pixels, then that's a rem for the whole page, and the whole page that everything on the page is defined using rems and ems will scale based on that. And then at a smaller font size or at a smaller breakpoint, use a smaller font size, and things will just kind of scale down for you.
Right.
And you don't have to put media queries all over your style sheet. You just have one media query up at the top, or you use like Mike Ruthmiller's scalar. I forget what he calls it, but he's got like a whole formula for allowing your font size to just fluidly scale between, whatever endpoints you want to set on it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's one thing I picked up from your book was about applying a font size to the HTML element. Was that and using the calculate, calc function for sizing up there as that. I never, I think I never thought about that. I always thought about like, hey, you just put it in the body or something like that. Is there like a super awesome benefit for putting on the root node?
There's, just kind of what I was just saying about it. It redefines a rem for the whole page.
Okay.
And so if you're able to stop thinking about exactly what everything is in pixels, that just magically resizes for you. And the whole page, as long as you're consistent with ems and rems where you want it to be, it'll just respond. And you don't have to spend a lot of time calculating exactly, because there's a lot of math. If you want to know how many pixels, a 1.2 M font is, you've got to do all this division and stuff. But if you can just kind of let that go, it'll do it for you.
Okay, cool. And then also I just, and I also put like, box sizing on like a wild card selector, but you also put it in the book as onto the root node as well. And then, but you still use it for, this after and before, like with so I guess that goes back to the whole like issue of just setting it globally for that. So, and just basically you also used inherit as well as that too.
Yeah.
So
and that hasn't been as much of a problem lately, but if you're using like some older plugins, maybe some old jQuery plugins or whatnot, sometimes they come with CSS that expects the old content box model. And so if you've got everything set explicitly selecting universally, every element on the page is forced into the border box, and it can break that plugin that you've got on the page. But if you have it inheriting, you can just kind of override it on the container and inherit down.
Oh, wow. Okay. Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Well, I've want to step back also, we're talking about your book and I'm just peppering you with like CSS nerd questions. So how was the process for writing the book?
It was hard. It took a lot longer than I expected. I was at it for at least 2.5 years, almost 3.
Yeah.
And it was basically a second job. Yeah. So I'd just run off to the coffee shop, a few evenings a week. I would, in my lunch hour, I would hide in a conference room at work and just crank away at it. It kind of killed. I'm a runner. I love running, but it totally killed my running. I had to drop out of a marathon and change it down to a half marathon because I just didn't have the time to train for it.
Oh, no. Books are a time commitment because it's amazing. You have to like find the time and squeeze it in, and it's amazing how isolating of a process it is to write a book, and then it's like, oh, here it is. So yeah.
I found myself very in my mind. Like I would spend time just thinking about how do I want to structure this topic so that it flows, that it makes sense the order I go through principles, and it took a while to. I was just in this habit of every time I'd get in the shower, it would be think about the chapter I'm working on, piecing it together, and it took a while after I was done to kind of be like, it's okay, I can relax. I'm allowed to not think about nothing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's great having written a book before. So, but the process. So why did you want to write this book?
I felt like there was a gap in the world of CSS books. I felt like there is a lot of introductory stuff. It's just very basic. Here's HTML. Here's what a selector is. Here's how this works. And there's some very good resources for people who already have a good handle on CSS. There's like Leah Verou's CSS not tricks. What I forget the title of her book.
It's like Killer. Or is it? I have it somewhere.
Secrets,
yeah, Killer Secrets,
something like that. Yeah. But there's an intermediate gap for people who kind of know CSS. They know enough to get by, but they get frustrated with the language. And I know a lot of developers who are great at JavaScript, and they just kind of have this. They're just kind of stuck in CSS, and it's hard to know where to go next when you want to learn more CSS. There's not like a clear path through. And so I really wanted my book to be something that would show the pitfalls. Here's the things you've probably struggled with and how to overcome them and why they work the way they do, because there's a reason for it. And some of it is, there's just an old hack. Floats are an old hack. But other things are, the document flow on the page behaves this way for a reason, so that you don't have to make sure nothing overlaps. Nothing will overlap unless you screw that up, kind of thing. And so I wanted to provide a path through the pitfalls, and also bring in other best practices, such as thinking modular, understanding SMACs and BEM and that kind of mindset. So I feel like it landed in a good spot. Even with some of the other updates that have come out, the definitive guide just got a great update, but his is more of a reference book. It's a very comprehensive, it's got everything in it, and it's that you can tell by the size. It's got everything in it.
Yeah, it's like 800 pages of.
I think it's over 1,000.
Oh, 1,000 pages. Yeah, it's like
so.
Pages.
I really wanted something that was at a readable size, and so I fought really hard to keep my size down. I'm at about 440 pages, I think, is my final.
I can check for you right now if you want.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, 444. So yeah.
So
that includes the index too, indexes are always great.
Fairly lengthy, yeah. So I fought really hard. I made a lot of really hard decisions. There were topics I really wanted to talk about, but I was constantly asking myself, is this really important? I want this to be a book that someone can read all the way through and progress from where I start to where I end, without bogging down with more than they really need. And at the same time, I throw in a lot of, here's this, if you want to go down this road, here's a great resource to go dive deeper into transforms and 3D manipulation, that sort of stuff.
So what topics did you leave out?
What did I leave out? That's a good question. I wish I had my table of contents.
I can go through it right now, just so just so people know who are like, hey, try to buy this book. Let me go through. You got the Cascade, Inheritance, relative units, box model, sense of floats. I don't want to put you on the spot. That's what I'm kind of doing. Flex blocks, grid layout, positioning, responsive design, which is like, I saw that chapter. I was like, oh, that's like a whole book. Modules.
Yeah, it was hard to fit in one chapter.
Yeah, I was really impressed with that as someone who's written a few books. I was like, wow, he took it on. Modular CSS, pattern libraries, background, shadows, and blend modes, I thought it was pretty cool. That was really good. Contrast, color, spacing, topography, which could also be a book. Transitions, transforms, animations. That's a really good book. That's like really comprehensive as it is. It is. So
I covered a lot of ground, and so it is a weird blend of, I go really deep into the stuff you've got to go deep into, like box model and layout and that sort of thing. And other things I just kind of go, here's this. It's fairly straightforward how a box shadow works. Now you know it. Let's move on. I tried to make good judgment calls as far as I left out things that are far future still. And I made a few misjudgments there. I wish I had covered shapes. Those are appearing in browsers sooner. And I wish I had covered variable fonts, which took off right as I finished the book.
Yeah. Those have just seemed kind of blew up, because last year we did CSS DevConf, and we had Jason Parmetel, and he just he talked about variable fonts and how they were coming, and then they came.
They made it really fast in browsers.
Yeah, it's like I think they realized that embedding 3 or 4 typefaces into a web page is not a good way. But if you do variable fonts, with the delta changes of a base font, it's just a lot faster and you get a lot more robust. I think the browser vendors kind of realized, hey, that's pretty much how I go.
It's a great perf game. It's a lot of fun. I'm just played with it just a little bit. And I can't wait to play with it more and see where it goes. Yeah. But I also did other things that I think I did make a good call. I mean, I spent a whole chapter on Grid. And I was writing it before it was implemented before it was enabled in any of the browsers. And they just exploded. They all turned it on in the same year. I talked about, speaking of fonts, I talked about the font loading behavior. There's the property to control, do you swap out the font immediately? Do you show nothing and wait for it to load? Things like that. And I talked about kind of the performance implications of web fonts and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so you did talk about Grid. I guess one of the things I was going to ask you is this: like you did talk about floats and using floats for layouts, and I was like, wow, you covered Grid, but then you also talk about like a basic, not a basic, but just like the I don't want to say it's basic, but just like the approach for doing a float-based grid system as well. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were about that. It just seems like you're just trying to be backwards compatible as well as.
Yeah, I think there's definitely there's gonna be. I mean, we're right on a turning point, but there's still a lot out there on the web that's float-based. If you're using Bootstrap, it's still float-based.
Right.
And even some of the newer frameworks that have a Flexbox-based grid still follow a lot of the same principles. You create a row element, and then you put column elements inside of that, and you've got to deal with, how does the padding work on each side of each column. And the principle there's basically the same. So I think it's important to know how to maintain that stuff and work with it in your day-to-day job, while also knowing that pattern is going away and we're moving towards grid and hopefully subgrid in the next year or two.
So what's subgrid? Subgrid.
So the way CSS Grid works is you declare that a container has display grid, and that makes all of its immediate child elements grid items, and they will align to the grid that you define. So you set how many columns and how many rows, but you don't have any explicit control over grandchild elements or elements within the child element. You can style them, but they don't align to the outer grid. And you can define a grid inside of a grid, but right now there's no way to say, I want this deeply nested child to align to the first column I defined in the outer grid. Okay. Or it won't automatically grow to fill the row of the other level up in the DOM. And subgrid is a way to do that. It's basically a way to say, okay, there's an outer grid defined, and I want that to apply down to the grandchildren.
Okay. And
then you can it'll give a lot more freedom how we structure the DOM while still making everything align to one master grid.
Okay, so if I apply, I'm not sure if I follow. So if I have a grid, and then if I wanted to carry this grid to children elements, I can just pull it down. Is that okay? So
you can just say this right now. The syntax is something like so you have 3 levels of DOM elements. You've got the container, you've got the child, and you've got the grandchildren. And so right now you say display grid on the container, and you can define your grid with columns and rows. And then on the child, what you would say is display grid subgrid. And that basically says, take whatever. So if this child element fills 2 columns and 2 rows, its children will align with those same 2 columns and 2 rows.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
So that way, things at multiple levels of the DOM can all align neatly.
So it's more traditional page layout. It seems like.
Exactly.
So we're trying getting Quark Express into our or InDesign, actually, what the new kids would say, into our browser. So I think I just dated myself, hardcore. Cool, awesome, yeah. Because I was working on a grid system over the weekend, and so what I wanted to do was I had a grid, and it had different columns depending on the breakpoints. And so, but I want to throw in an element in the mixture of this, like, grid that just expanded the whole entire width of other things. So I pretty much just said, like, okay, I'm throwing a monkey wrench into my grid. How do I make it so that it fits the entire width of my grid without it being like nasty? And so like the way I approached it was I went for this easiest way of implementing grid, because I didn't want to like spend forever just like running up a grid. And so I had this like grid template columns auto, and just do auto on the parent, and then like boom, which is like I've got columns. Like, oh, this is fantastic. And then
it's amazing how little code it takes.
I know. I said I want to know exactly how much little code, because this is a really small web page and website I don't want to be concerned with. It's like a personal project. I don't want to be like messing around. I don't want to do like name columns, name regions, whatever. I just want it up and running. And so I know if I actually like flesh it out more, I could probably like say, hey, whenever this thing happens, go across. But I didn't want to actually do that. So so yeah. So if you have any thoughts on how to make that happen, I appreciate it. But basically, you were trying to
make one of the grid items fill the whole, all the columns.
Yeah.
Did you do like a grid column 1/-1 or something along those lines?
You can do negative values? I didn't even know you can do that.
Yeah, as long as the grid is explicitly defined, meaning you're not just doing an auto fit, which will create. Actually, that may not even be true. As long as you're not aligning, there's a thing called implicit grid, which is basically letting the browser add rows and columns where it needs to. But if you're not using implicit grid, the negative, so it's positive on the. I'm trying to decide whether I need to reverse my hands for the video. The lines start on the left, say for columns, or the top for rows, and they count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But they start on the right at negative, and they go -1, -2, -3, -4. So you can align from the left or the right of your grid.
Okay. Oh, that's awesome. Okay.
Or you can do span. There's just so many options.
That's exactly. So
it's.
Yeah, so that's one thing.
Tell it span 3 columns and
do
it.
I think like every time I spend a little time with grid, I feel like I need to spend 10 times more time with grid just to figure out everything with it. So I appreciate all the work you put into writing the book. So because I mean, as someone who's written a book, I know it takes a lot of time, but it's a lot of things to master. I mean, like we talked about what you covered in this book already, from responsive to I mean, there's so many things that CSS can do, and to be able to wrap your head, because it's both like right brain and left brain working together.
Yeah, definitely.
And like, but like the thing that kind of amazes me is like how awesome CSS is, and then how how much it gets slagged by developers, right? Front end developers, and like even in your preface, you say like CSS is probably the most neglected part of the web stack, and like, well, why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I think part of it is the syntax is so simple, and so when you go to learn it, especially initially, you go, oh, okay, I get it. You just say the selector and you apply some rules and it does it. And when you are working with basic tutorials, you have really simple code, really simple markup, and the CSS doesn't get very complicated. And so it is really easy in a simple tutorial. It's very straightforward. But when you get into large, complex apps, you get into having to write CSS for a website with 4,000 pages. It's a whole other world, and there's not. It lulled you into this sense of, oh, I got this. This is a piece of cake. And then all of a sudden you find yourself, wading through a mess that you don't know how you got into the trouble that you're in, and you don't know how to get out of it.
Right.
And I think, and then learning how to fix that, there isn't a clear way forward. Like there aren't, like I said, like the reason I write this book is because there wasn't a lot of material out there for people who knew CSS but didn't really know how to really work with it proficiently. And I wanted to give a roadmap to help people in that situation.
So one thing I find out is that is that it is so simple to use and so easy to get your stuck. like you mentioned before, is that if developers took the time to learn JavaScript, like an iota of much as they would take to learn CSS, I think they would see how powerful it is and what they could do. Because I mean, it's hard watching people who are pros at JavaScript just stumble over some basic CSS functionality.
Yes.
Just like, it's, so it's like, so someone had a tweet, I forgot who said it was like, CSS is so stupid on one hand, and then, or it's so powerful on the other hand. So which one is it? Which one do you want?
Yeah.
So it's kind of crazy, but yeah. I don't know why it's flagged up. I think just because it doesn't do, it's not like, it's not on the server as JavaScript is. It's not ubiquitous like JavaScript is, but I think it's pretty powerful. Like, and just to have that grids adopt so fast, have verbal fonts adopt so fast, I don't think it's gonna go anywhere anytime.
No, I mean, it's changing so fast right now. It's wild.
Right. So, and just so people, I did find the code that mentioned about columns. So it's I use grid area, and I did 2/1/span1/span4. It's like 4-column grid. So
okay.
So yeah. So and that solved the problem. So I was like, oh man, this is fantastic. So yeah, cool. Is there anything that you particularly learned after going through the book? Is it like you went into a lot of different areas of CSS? What anything new that you learned that you didn't know about CSS before?
That's a good question. I mean, grid and even Flexbox, I only had a basic grasp on when I started writing. I was just amazed how writing a book is a great way to commit everything to memory. People complain about having a hard time learning all the properties of Flex, all properties of Grid. It's like, I've got it because I spent months, immersed in it.
Yeah.
And it forced me to really dig into just some of the stuff I knew, but I didn't really know exactly how to articulate rendering performance and the whole render pipeline, animations, and what really makes how do you be have performant animation. There's not a lot of new things I learned, but my depth of understanding definitely went up when I was forced to articulate exactly how things behave.
Yeah, definitely with animation, it's something that you don't always need, but it's there, and just to be able to have a rock solid understanding of it. I actually read in this book. I probably was like I always feel like a little trepidatious, like, oh, I need to write some animation. Like, oh man. Okay, how do we do this? And so, I mean, but with animations, it just seems like animations now is just like you just port it over to JavaScript now. It seems like that'd be like kind of the way to do it. Is that true? Or
I think there's definitely use cases where that's the way to go. I think there's also use cases where it makes sense to just do it in plain CSS, and a lot of it's going to come down to the complexity of what you're doing. Especially if there's any complex timing of multiple animations, you're probably going to want a JavaScript library to help you orchestrate that. GreenSock is just amazing.
Yeah.
You can just define all your animations and tell it, make the whole thing last this long, and it'll adjust everything to fit. Or you can tell it, play this in reverse, and it'll do it for you. Yeah. And if you're doing that in vanilla CSS, the number of changes it would take to make those manipulations would just be unbearable.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think if you want to do like a one-off, really simple CSS animation, that's, I think CSS is the way to go. But then like, if you want to do anything like remotely complex with timing or anything like that, I mean, it's a hornet's nest just to try to do it in CSS. And so, yeah. And so just to tell you how fuddy-duddy and old I am, I remember when Apple actually said, hey, we're doing CSS, we're doing animations, we're doing the CSS. I'm like, isn't that? And I was like, that should be in JavaScript. I don't think that should be CSS because we're actually changing the behavior of an element on the page. That's like square one in the JavaScript realm. But
yeah. I think those lines have definitely blurred.
Yeah, Apple didn't listen to me. I don't know why they didn't listen to me. So, yeah. Any other things you want to mention about your book? I'm just going to go one through.
I have a discount code.
Oh man. Okay. There you go. What is the discount code?
Okay, it's a bunch of random letters.
Okay. Well, that's even better. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll put it in the show notes for sure.
Okay. It is CTW NBSS.
Okay. There you go.
CTW NBSS. And that works on manning.com. And I believe that is 40% off anything on their website.
Okay.
It might be 30 if I might be misremembering that, but I think it's 40%.
Yeah. Well, definitely. Definitely with the discount. You should buy the book before the discount, but now if you have a discount, you should definitely pick it up. So cool. And the book is CSS in Depth. Thank you so much, Keith, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So
there it is.
Yeah, and congratulations on writing the book. I know it's
thanks.
Again, I keep on laboring over how crazy it is to write a book, but it's pretty crazy. But and like all that isolation, all that time you mentioned, like I get PSTD just thinking about it. Cool. Where can people find you on the web?
I'm at keithjgrant.com. I'm Keith J. Grant on Twitter. I'm Keith J. Grant pretty much everywhere.
Okay.
So
cool. Yeah, and also you just written an interesting blog post too, I think.
Yes.
What was the title of that one? I forgot.
Resilient, declarative, contextual.
Okay. Yeah. Just so can you tease that one as we?
Yeah, I wanted to dive into kind of the mindset of working in CSS and what sets it apart from writing JavaScript or Python or whatever language. Just the characteristics of the language that you have to think about differently. And I identified those three things about CSS: that it's resilient, it holds up to network faults and things like that, but also that you can do progressive enhancement. You can write code that won't work in some browsers, and that's okay. It's declarative, which gives you a lot more power to just, as we were saying earlier, you can define a whole grid in just a couple lines of code. And it's contextual. Even with best practices of trying to make things modular, you still always need to have a little bit of your mind thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about how does this element behave in the page, not just totally in isolation. And those are things that can be unfamiliar, especially if you're coming from a world of JavaScript thinking.
Yeah, because it's definitely like the idea is just the modules and components and everything. Just like we just wrap everything in a tiny bow when we send it off into the internet, and like your CSS doesn't touch my CSS because it's all in JavaScript now, and we don't want to touch each other, and that's great. So we're all happy. Cool, awesome. Well, thanks again for being on the show, and definitely pick up the book CSS in Depth. And cool. All right, thanks so much.
Excellent.
Cool.
Thank you.
Awesome.